He knows what happened. I know what happened. And there's only one of us telling the truth. And I know that's...
The timeline was damning. Their friendship stretched back to the 1990s, with Epstein attending events at royal residences, sometimes even photographed at Balmoral. In 2010, long after Epstein had served time for sex offenses, Prince Andrew was still seen with him in New York. Not briefly, not in passing. He stayed at Epstein's home, walked with him in Central Park, smiled in the same frame. When the British public saw those images, something cracked. There were no more excuses, no more "he didn't know." He knew, and yet he returned. Then came Virginia Giuffre. Her name would become unforgettable in royal history. She accused Epstein of trafficking her as a teenager and stated, publicly and unequivocally, that Prince Andrew had been part of it. She described encounters in London, New York, and on Epstein's private island. She gave details disturbing, explicit, and unwavering. A photograph surfaced. Prince Andrew's arm wrapped around her waist. Ghislaine Maxwell smiling in the background. That image haunted the monarchy, a visual relic that refused to fade. Buckingham Palace responded swiftly, calling the allegations false, the photo possibly doctored. But the world wasn't convinced. People didn't just want denial, they wanted accountability. As the pressure mounted, more evidence began to appear. Flight logs placing Andrew and Giuffre in the same locations. Eyewitness accounts, testimonies from other victims, and then new names came forward. Caroline Kaufman, Johanna Sjoberg, even Epstein's private pilot. All mentioned Andrew. All painted a picture of proximity, of complicity, of a royal far too close to a predator. In one case, it was revealed that Andrew had allegedly received a foot massage from young women at Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. In another, emails hinted at deeper involvement than he ever admitted. Every new headline brought fresh outrage, and each denial felt thinner than the last. The palace, desperate to control the fallout, stripped him of titles, severed public duties, and tried to draw a line. But the public wasn't done. Protesters appeared outside Buckingham Palace. The FBI wanted answers, and in the court of public opinion, the verdict was already in. What once felt like a PR crisis had become a moral reckoning. One man's scandal was now a stain on an entire institution, and while the monarchy tried to protect itself, one person couldn't hide from the emotional wreckage: his daughter. With each headline, Beatrice's world began to change, but she stayed silent until now. Sometimes silence says more than words, and Beatrice said nothing. While the media storm around Prince Andrew exploded with accusations, photos, and legal filings, Princess Beatrice remained an island of stillness. No statements, no interviews, not a single word defending him or condemning him. It was as if she had vanished, swallowed by the palace's towering walls and the weight of a scandal too immense to name. But even silence can speak volumes, and hers echoed louder than anyone expected. To those closest to her, Beatrice's quiet presence at her father's side was the only message they needed. She attended private family functions. She stood beside him in public when the monarchy still allowed it. And when she walked down the aisle in 2020, married in the shadow of the Queen's tiara, it was Andrew who gave her away. That image alone, a father leading his daughter into a new chapter, felt like a final moment of normalcy before everything collapsed. For Beatrice, it wasn't a royal protocol. It was a personal truth. She still loved her father. But love doesn't come without conflict. The public didn't see tenderness. They saw complicity. They questioned her silence. Was it loyalty? Was she afraid? Or had the trauma of watching her father's name dragged through the mud left her, frozen, unsure how to step forward without hurting someone she loved or betraying what she believed in? And those questions turned into headlines, speculation, commentary from talk shows and tabloids alike. In a world where everyone demands a side, Beatrice refused to take one, and so the silence grew heavier. For months, she disappeared from royal coverage. No public appearances, no charity speeches, no glossy photo ops. While her cousins took on new royal roles and the family scrambled to protect what remained of its reputation, Beatrice faded into the background. But this wasn't retreat. It was reckoning. Away from the noise, she was quietly reckoning with the truth the public couldn't see. The same man who cheered her school plays, who held her as a baby, who called her his pride, was now at the center of a global scandal. And in the stillness of that realization, Beatrice wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a daughter in pain. Behind the palace gates, her world had shifted. And though the royal motto had always been, "Never complain, never explain," there came a point when that silence no longer protected anyone. It suffocated her. Because silence, once a shield, had become a prison. And what it kept buried: her anger, her guilt, her truth was rising. But she didn't stay silent forever. What she finally said stunned everyone. She didn't scream. She didn't post. She simply said the truth. After years of silence, speculation, and scrutiny, Princess Beatrice broke her silence not with a press conference, not with palace fanfare, but with words so quiet they felt like a whisper. And yet, they hit with the force of a storm. Her statement wasn't political. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't dripping in royal polish. It was raw, honest, human. And in that rare moment of vulnerability, the world finally saw her not as a figure in a gilded family, but as a daughter, fighting to reconcile love and betrayal, duty and justice. Beatrice didn't attempt to defend the indefensible. She didn't excuse her father's past or mask the horror of what had come to light. Instead, she stood in a place few royals ever dare: the middle. The place where you can still love someone and hold them accountable. In her own words, she spoke of the pain her silence had caused, not just to herself, but to the survivors. She acknowledged the women who had suffered. She admitted that for too long, she had watched from the sidelines, paralyzed between loyalty and morality. And that paralysis had become its own kind of betrayal. She called what happened to those women an injustice. Not just in legal terms, but in human terms, in moral terms. She didn't reduce them to victims in a story that wasn't theirs to control. She gave them their place, their power, and she made it clear. They had always been in her thoughts, even when she didn't have the courage to say it out loud. This wasn't a media strategy. It was a confession of pain, of guilt, of a daughter grappling with a father's fall and a nation's judgment. But perhaps the most powerful line came when she spoke of love. She didn't deny it. She didn't bury it under public expectation. She said it clearly. She still loved her father. Not blindly, not without sorrow, but she loved him. And that love, she explained, doesn't mean silence. It means truth. Truth even when it hurts. Truth even when it changes everything. Because love without truth, she said, is just fear wearing a kind face. That message struck a nerve. It wasn't grand. It wasn't scripted for sympathy. It was sincere. And that sincerity shook the very foundation of what the royal family had built itself upon for centuries: discretion, distance, denial. Beatrice's statement didn't burn bridges, it lit a path. One where grief and responsibility could coexist. Where someone born into power could admit weakness and still remain strong. Where silence could be broken, not for spectacle, but for healing. But this wasn't just about a daughter and a father. It was about a monarchy built on silence. The royals have always hidden behind walls, but this time, those walls cracked. Buckingham Palace has long been a fortress not just of stone and ceremony, but of silence. For decades, it withstood affairs, divorces, even abdications. The crown endured because it rarely acknowledged the chaos beneath. But when the scandal surrounding Prince Andrew became impossible to contain, the institution did something it almost never does. It acted. Not swiftly, not boldly, but unmistakably. Andrew was stripped of his royal duties. The military, titles, the patronages, the privilege of public appearances all gone in a single breathless statement. And though it sounded like protocol, the message was clear. Even a prince isn't untouchable anymore. Then came the ripple. Princess Beatrice's emotional statement shattered the palace's carefully guarded image of unity. Her words weren't filtered through royal advisors. They weren't polished with political correctness. They were raw, real. And suddenly, the monarchy was forced into a place it hates: vulnerability. The public response was staggering. Some praised her courage, others questioned the timing, but almost no one stayed silent. It was the first time in years that someone within the inner circle had shown that the crown wasn't immune to pain, to conflict, to the weight of reckoning. And the royal family knew it. Whispers began almost immediately. Had Beatrice been pressured into speaking? Was this part of a carefully orchestrated damage control plan, or had she broken ranks? Sources close to the palace hinted at tensions behind the scenes, that her honesty had blindsided the firm, that her words, though genuine, came at a cost. Because in a family where silence is loyalty, truth feels like betrayal. And even though she hadn't turned her back on her father, she had cracked open a door the palace desperately wanted to keep shut. Princess Beatrice had always stood by her father, but this time, she couldn't. What she just revealed has shaken the monarchy and left her in tears. For years, Princess Beatrice kept her composure. No matter the accusations leveled against Prince Andrew, her father, she stayed silent. Not out of denial, but out of something more complicated: loyalty, love, and perhaps fear. Fear of what would happen if she said what she really felt. Because to speak was to break tradition. And Beatrice was raised to preserve it. She was the dutiful daughter, the one who never courted headlines, never stirred controversy, never gave the press what they wanted. But silence has a cost, and Beatrice bore it quietly for far too long. Behind palace walls, behind royal smiles, she carried a burden that only grew heavier with every new revelation about her father. From the outside, their bond seemed unbreakable. Prince Andrew had walked her down the aisle. He had kissed her forehead after graduation. He had laughed with her at charity events, eyes glimmering with paternal pride. To her, he wasn't a disgraced duke. He was Dad, the man who cheered from the sidelines, who helped with homework, who gave her the confidence to pursue a life outside royal duties. And so, when the world turned its back on him, Beatrice didn't rush to defend or condemn. She simply stayed quiet. Until now. The announcement came not as a grand royal declaration, but as something far more intimate, a deeply personal reckoning, one that peeled away the layers of royal armor to reveal a daughter, broken. Her voice trembled as she acknowledged the weight of the silence she'd kept for so long. And while she didn't excuse her father's actions, she didn't deny her love for him either. That paradox, loving someone who may have done unforgivable things, was what tore her apart. But it was also what made her human. In her message, she didn't attempt to rewrite history. She didn't blame the press, or the victims, or the legal system. Instead, she admitted something far more powerful: that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, can feel like betrayal. Her words were raw, stripped of any royal gloss. And in that moment, the world didn't see a princess. It saw a woman wrestling with heartbreak, shame, and the collapse of everything she thought she understood about the man who raised her. But to understand her heartbreak, we must go back to the life she carved for herself, far from the royal spotlight. While others wore crowns, she chose a career. But the palace never forgot her name. From the beginning, Princess Beatrice refused to be boxed in by expectations. She was born into a world of tradition, of rehearsed waves and whispered secrets behind velvet curtains. But she didn't want to just wear the tiara, she wanted to earn something of her own. And so, while most royals embraced the duties assigned to them by birth, Beatrice quietly built a life beyond the palace gates. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was intentional. And every move she made was a step away from the shadow of the crown. Her first break from tradition didn't come through rebellion. It came through hard work. In the summer of 2008, Beatrice took a job at Selfridges, not as a face of fashion or a royal ambassador, but as a sales assistant, folding clothes, assisting customers, learning the grind from the ground up. To the public, it was unheard of a princess on the shop floor. But to Beatrice, it was a glimpse, into the real world, a place where titles didn't define worth, and every earned pound came with purpose. She didn't stop there. Eager to understand how the world worked behind the scenes, she took an unpaid position in the press office of the Foreign Office. And later, whispers swirled that she even considered journalism. The Financial Times was reportedly her target, not for attention, but for insight. She wanted to learn, to write, to have a voice of her own that didn't require royal endorsement. Every role she took, every headline she avoided, was her way of creating space between who she was born as and who she wanted to be. And then, in 2009, she crossed a line no royal had before. She stepped into fiction literally. A small cameo in The Young Victoria marked her as the first royal to appear in a fictional film. It wasn't a headline role. She had no lines. But that wasn't the point. It was a quiet declaration that she could be more than a figurehead, more than a photo op, more than tradition allowed. When her stint at Sony Pictures ended abruptly due to a hacking scandal, many thought she'd retreat. But instead, she made her boldest move yet. She left. Not just her job, but her country. New York City became her new beginning. A place where she could live without royal reporters tailing her every step. She worked. She traveled back and forth. And she did it under a simple name, Beatrice York. No titles. No palace press releases. Just a woman rebuilding her identity on her own terms. By 2017, she had found her place at Affinity, a tech firm focused on transforming customer experiences. But Beatrice didn't just want to work, she wanted to lead. As Vice President of Partnerships and Strategy, she carved out initiatives aimed at elevating women in business. She championed causes that often went unnoticed by the royal circuit. Behind boardroom doors, she wasn't a princess, she was a strategist, a mentor, a builder of opportunities. And still, she never abandoned her heritage. Beatrice continued to attend weddings, charity galas, and royal commemorations. But unlike her cousins, she held no official royal duties. And that gave her something they didn't have. Freedom. Freedom to choose her causes. Freedom to live without protocol. Freedom to create a legacy built not on birthright, but on decisions. Yet, even with her own life built in freedom, the shadow of her father's legacy followed closely behind. She was the quiet one, the gentle soul in a world of crowns and critics. Long before scandal shadowed her family, Princess Beatrice lived a life shaped by quiet strength. Born into a monarchy that often rewards stoicism over sentiment, she found her footing not through fanfare, but through grace. While others wore their titles like armor, Beatrice led with warmth. She didn't seek attention. She sought meaning. And from the very beginning, she found it in one place above all, her sister. Princess Eugenie wasn't just her sibling. She was her mirror, her anchor, her constant in a world where nothing stayed still for long. Together, they were inseparable, two girls growing up in castles, yet craving normalcy. When their parents, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, divorced in 1996, it should have splintered their world. But instead of breaking apart, the sisters clung tighter. Their bond became the quiet engine of Beatrice's resilience. And though the royal family did its best to project unity, Beatrice had already learned a painful truth. Behind the fairy tale, real families break too. Education offered her an escape. She was diligent, curious, and fiercely committed to carving her own identity. At St. George's School in Ascot, and later at Goldsmiths College, she kept her head down while the tabloids chased after louder stories. But behind the scenes, something deeper stirred. Beatrice was developing a passion not just for academia, but for advocacy. Her work in mental health and children's education wasn't performative. It was personal. She understood, perhaps better than most, how fragile life could be when lived under scrutiny. And she wanted to help others find peace, where she once found pressure. That same yearning for peace led her to a man far removed from palace life. Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi, a property developer with a refined charm and a grounded past, entered her world quietly, but stayed with conviction. Their love story didn't play out in scandal sheets or paparazzi flashes. It bloomed gently. And when the world shut down during the pandemic, they chose to marry not with pomp, but with purpose. A private chapel, a borrowed gown, a tiara steeped in history. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about starting fresh. With Eduardo came an unexpected role stepmother. His son, Christopher, nicknamed Wolfie, became part of her world, and she embraced him with the same softness that had defined her since childhood. Then, in September 2021, their family grew once more with the birth of Sienna Elizabeth, a daughter, a symbol of continuity, a name that honored the Queen herself. For a moment, it seemed Beatrice had found her peace at last, a life she built with care, filled with purpose and love, away from the chaos of court. But this peaceful life was soon interrupted by whispers, headlines, and eventually, a storm. It started as whispers. Then came photos, documents, and the world's eyes on Prince Andrew. At first, the murmurs were easy to dismiss: vague reports, nameless sources, subtle headlines tucked behind stories of state dinners and royal weddings. But slowly, the walls began to shake. The name Jeffrey Epstein resurfaced, no longer as a shadowy figure whispered about in elite circles, but as a man convicted of unimaginable crimes. And standing next to him, in more than one photograph, was Prince Andrew, the Queen's son. The same man who once represented Britain in diplomatic matters, now facing questions he couldn't outrun. The connection seemed strange at first, almost accidental. But the deeper reporters dug, the more tangled the web became. King Charles, now the monarch, faced a different kind of challenge than his mother ever did. In the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, silence no longer protects, it exposes. And so, without making a show of it, Charles made his own move. Security funding for Andrew was pulled. Private residences no longer guarded at taxpayer expense. It was a quiet message sent with loud consequences. The monarchy will no longer shield what the world no longer tolerates. Behind the scenes, the palace was shifting. There was no press conference, no royal decree. But insiders reported a change in tone. More openness, more transparency, more accountability, not because they wanted it, but because Beatrice had forced it. Her pain had become a mirror, reflecting not just a father's downfall, but a system built on avoiding responsibility. And now, even the crown had to look at its own reflection. But Andrew wasn't done making headlines. What followed sealed his fate forever. From palaces to protests, from diplomacy to disgrace, Prince Andrew lost it all. His descent wasn't sudden. It wasn't one scandal, one mistake, or one damning headline. It was a slow, relentless unraveling, the kind that begins with unchecked power and ends in utter collapse. Once hailed as a royal asset, Andrew had walked the corridors of diplomacy, dealt with world leaders, and carried the Queen's banner across continents. But beneath the medals and titles, another world festered, one built on shadowy deals, quiet favors, and connections that would one day drag him to the depths of public shame. The Epstein scandal had been the ignition, but it wasn't the only fire. Soon after, reports emerged of business dealings that left even his staunchest defenders uneasy. Emails leaked. Documents surfaced. It was alleged that Andrew had leveraged his royal title to open doors for foreign financiers, some tied to ethically questionable regimes. And among them, one connection stood out: a Chinese businessman later banned from the UK due to links with covert government operations. Andrew had met him, dined with him, introduced him to power. And when the press found out, there was no defense strong enough to weather the storm. Inside palace walls, the facade cracked further. Former staff began speaking out. Not about crimes, but about cruelty. Stories of verbal tirades, obsessive control, and even bizarre demands involving stuffed animals arranged in perfect order every night. Servants once silenced by duty now painted a picture of a man fueled by entitlement and blind to consequence. Behind the smile was a temper. Behind the charm, a shadow. And the public, already skeptical, began to believe every word. Then came the final wave. In 2020, a protest erupted outside Buckingham Palace. It wasn't just political, it was personal. Survivors, activists, and everyday citizens demanded accountability. And it didn't stop there. Andrew's Windsor residence was broken into twice. Protesters followed his car, shouting accusations. Onlookers no longer bowed. They stared, they whispered, they turned away. By 2021, lawsuits loomed on both sides of the Atlantic. His name was no longer associated with honor. It was synonymous with disgrace. And the royal family? They backed away. Not with loud declarations, but with distance. Charles cut the funding. Siblings avoided the cameras. Even palace Christmas portraits subtly cropped him out. It was erasure by omission. The institution that once shielded him had now chosen survival over sentiment. There would be no comeback tour, no staged redemption, no royal rehabilitation. The door had closed. Permanently. And in the end, Prince Andrew, once a figure of strength, status, and royal legacy, was left alone. No press conferences, no final words, just silence. A silence that echoed louder than any denial ever could. Because sometimes, when a man falls from power, what truly haunts him isn't the punishment. It's the absence of forgiveness. Beatrice's story is not just royal gossip. It's a reminder of what it means to choose truth over tradition. How do you love someone who broke the world's trust? That's the question Princess Beatrice never asked aloud, but lived with every single day. She didn't need the public to remind her of what her father had done. She already knew. And not just the headlines, the timelines, or the accusations, but the emotional wreckage left in their wake. Beatrice had loved a man who was once her protector, her anchor. And now, she had to reckon with the unbearable truth that the man who had lifted her up had also dragged down the dignity of an entire institution. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a betrayal of everything she thought she knew. And when she finally found the strength to speak, the world watched in silence. Some embraced her. They saw her as a symbol of courage, someone who dared to step out of the shadows, to break free from the royal mold, and tell the truth not just about her father, but about herself. But others weren't as kind. Critics accused her of being too late, too vague, too conflicted. They demanded more. They wanted outrage, disavowal, complete condemnation. But what they failed to understand was that Beatrice wasn't fighting the public's war. She was fighting her own. A war between loyalty and conscience, between history and healing. Even within her own family, the lines weren't clear. Her sister, Princess Eugenie, remained quiet. And in that silence, there was both solidarity and sorrow. Perhaps Eugenie was supporting Beatrice in private. Perhaps she was afraid to speak. Or perhaps, like her sister, she was still trying to figure out how to love a father without defending his sins. But one thing was clear, the sisters had always stood side by side. And this time would be no different, even if their words took different forms. In the end, Beatrice's story became something far bigger than herself. It wasn't just about royalty or reputation. It was about what it means to hold love in one hand and truth in the other, and still walk forward. She reminded the world that forgiveness is not forgetfulness, that loyalty is not blind obedience, and that sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is stand up not against the world, but against the silence you once thought protected you. Her tears weren't weakness. They were a daughter's final stand for her voice, her truth, and her peace. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.